On this episode of Booked on Rock, the story of one of the most influential bands in punk, metal, and alternative rock. The story of Kreuzen with author Sahan Jayasuriya.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. This episode's guest is Sahan Jayasuriya, the author of Don't Say Please, the oral history of Kreuzen. Sahan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
This is a book that was 10 years in the making. Tell us how it came together. You just spoke to so many people, including all the members of the band.
Yeah, I think I started officially I started the book 10 years ago, and I didn't have any publisher involved. And it was just kind of this thing that I was doing because I felt like this is a really important band for my city. It was clearly very influential, and I just wanted to tell their story and just kind of share it with anyone, not only the people who are fans of them, but hopefully, expose their music to, a whole new audience of listeners. And kind of the more research I did, the more I realized that they had pretty sizable following amongst, pretty prominent musicians. So over time, I just kind of kept reaching out to people and just setting up my own interviews. And, next thing I knew it was like 7 years in, and, I'm still like, am I done? Am I not done? And when Feral House got involved, that's when they were like, okay, I think you're in a pretty good place. Now you should, finish instead of just keep going. So they're kind of the ones who really got me to focus and kind of pare it down and edit it into the form that you see it in today.
One of the many people you spoke with was Butch Vig, legendary producer who produced the band's albums, and he said, quote, Kreuzen are one of those bands that influenced 1,000 other bands that went on to have huge success. Why they didn't have the same level of success is something we'll get into a little bit more, but I'm interested in finding out how you discovered this band. You were working at a record store, I believe.
Right. I was working at a legendary record shop in Milwaukee that's no longer around, called Atomic Records. And my boss at the time, they gave me a copy of their first 7-inch just to check out. And he knew I was into hardcore, and I didn't really know him as someone as being into hardcore, so I didn't really expect much of it, honestly. And when I took it home, it just blew me away. I was just I was not prepared for it. And I think one of the reasons that really blew me away is it didn't really sound like anything else I had heard at that time. And I'd heard a lot of hardcore, but there was a lot of elements about it that just didn't make sense to me in terms of the time that it was being made. So the vocals were way more aggressive. The music was a lot tighter. It was just a different thing. And then, the more that I kind of listened, the more questions I had. And I think me discovering their music more is also what kind of led me to eventually wanting to write a book, because I had so many questions that I just wanted to have answered myself. Right. But, as they evolved, they made this amazing debut album that's just straight ahead, super fast, super tight hardcore. And it's pretty much among that crowd, it's universally lauded. It's one of those hardcore records that most people can just agree on. Everyone loves it. And the problem with doing something like that is where do you go from there when you make this thing that people love so much? If there's no way that you could follow it up with a better version of that, right? So you have to do something different. And so they started to explore other styles of music, and it wasn't a conscious decision on their part. They just evolved based on what they were into, both the stuff that they grew up with, because they were really into, prog stuff when they were younger, and also the post-punk stuff and things like, Brian Eno and Wire. But there was newer influences that were coming into the fold for them, because they were really into the 4AD Records bands and just the kind of UK post-punk thing. So stuff like Sisters of Mercy and the 4AD stuff, you know what I mean? And bands like The Birthday Party too, for sure. And that was kind of coloring their sound, but they're coming from hardcore. So when you combine those two things, you're going to get something that's different. But, over time, I think some people got those records and some people didn't. And so when, I just kept kind of digging into their catalog, and it was just sort of I've called them sort of the proto everything band for 90s alt rock, because their catalog really does show a very, very broad range of what was happening in the underground in both in, I guess, in America and in UK, at least in their influence. It just covers such a broad range of like 80s underground guitar music. And those records were super influential for a lot of other artists who went on to achieve greater or much greater success in the following decade.
Let's talk about the band's origins. You write, quote, "It's debatable whether Die Kreuzen could have ever happened at any other time or in any other place besides the American Midwest during the 1980s. So give us the when, where, and the how the band comes together, if you could. The four guys, they all grew up in the right place, right time?"
I'd say so, yeah. Half of the band has origins in Rockford, Illinois. Most people might know that as being the hometown of Cheap Trick. And then the other half are from Brookfield, Wisconsin, which is a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And vocalist Dan Kabinski and Brian Agnes were the two guys who originally came from Rockford. They were in a band previously called the Stellas, and the Stellas moved up to Milwaukee. And, they quickly realized they didn't have a drummer when they moved there. So they asked their friend Keith Bramer if he knew anyone. He's like, well, I happen to know someone who's a really great drummer, who was drummer Eric Tunison. So he came into the fold. And not long after he joined the band, they kind of realized that their bassist at the time, they weren't really feeling it. It wasn't a good fit. And then they asked Keith to join the band. So then when they settled on that lineup, not long after, they changed their name from the Stellas to Die Kreuzen. And that was, I believe, at sometime in 1981 is when they changed the name to Die Kreuzen.
They were into a broad range of music, which you did talk about. But there are some. They were fans of the classic rock bands like Kiss, CCR, Zeppelin, AC/DC, sure. Aerosmith. There's a letter that bassist Keith Bramer wrote to Circus Magazine that's in the book. He was a defender of Zeppelin, Kiss, Angel, and Aerosmith.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I learned, I came up listening to punk and hardcore. I'm almost 40. I'll be turning 40 in October. So the classic rock thing was not really anything that I really paid much attention to as a young kid. I loved Queen. I was a huge Queen fan. But, some of the other bands maybe they didn't really connect with me. And it wasn't really until later in life that, especially like the glam stuff, that really resonated with me. And I think that came from really liking a lot of 70s punk. But a lot of the classic rock stuff didn't resonate with me. And I think it's because I had other, punk things to listen to. But the thing that I learned in researching this book and just reading about this period in general is a lot of people who listen to punk and hardcore bands, of course, they weren't listening to punk and hardcore because they were helping invent it. So they were listening to the heaviest music available, and the heaviest available was like hard rock and classic rock, and so many people, who are like kind of Gen X age group, they, Kiss was a big deal for them. It was like a early influence because it was just like, it was made for teenage kids. They look like cartoon characters, it's just guitar solos and flamethrowers and pinball machines. It makes so much sense for a certain a person of a certain age at a certain time to be a Kiss fan, right? So all those things were just like, the edgiest, like gnarliest thing available. And I think so many people who went on to play in punk and hardcore bands definitely did their time listening to, classic rock and glam. And that stuff, I mean, and Sweet and Slade and Bowie, all that stuff is great,
I think it's interesting in reading a lot about grunge bands and how much they were influenced by early Aerosmith and Black Sabbath. I hear that often. Early 100%. Aerosmith and Black Sabbath.
Yeah, well, I mean, the early Aerosmith records are pretty cool. I mean, especially, the vocalist for Die Kreuzen, Dan Kabinski, he cites Steven Tyler as a huge influence. When he first told me that in person years before I was writing the book, I was just like, I wasn't expecting it because, again, I didn't realize that some of these like people who made punk and hardcore were listening to classic rock. But then I was thinking about it. I was like, well, you think about the end of Dream On, where he's really pushing his voice into like screaming territory. I'm like, oh, that makes sense, But yeah, I mean, the grunge bands, I mean, Kurt Cobain was a huge fan of like a record like Rocks by Aerosmith. He loved that record, Yeah,
it's dirty. It's grungy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the drum sound of that record rules. That's a great record. I'm not like the world's biggest Aerosmith fan, but they have some records I would definitely dig for sure.
But at some point in the mid-'70s, punk rock enters the scene, and that has a huge impact on the guys, especially Keith. He was the first guy in town to talk about punk, according to drummer Eric Tunison. So Keith was the guy that knew punk.
Everyone has that friend, I think, who's just like so rabid about music, and they're just like the one who's always like on the thing right as it's happening. You know, at a certain age, I was definitely that guy with my friends, and I still am that guy to some degree, but definitely in my teen years, it's like I knew, about whatever new band or whoever's new record, like, as it was so important to me, and still is important to me. But there's that one person who's kind of like the town crier or something, right? Like they're the one who informs all their friends. They're the ones who's making the mixtapes and all that. And I think, yeah, Keith was definitely that guy for that friend group for sure. And he was the one who had all the early singles and buying the Clash record on import and all that stuff.
There was a point when the Stella sound evolved into something new, and this is around 1981. They would become known for their speed early on. What inspired that increased tempo and energy?
I think the speed thing definitely had, there was a couple records that was contributing to that. And I think like Group Sex by the Circle Jerks was a big one for a lot of people. I think that record came out pretty early on and it was pretty fast for the time. Also, like the early Bad Brains stuff was pretty fast. Some of the early Dead Kennedy stuff was getting fast. So the tempos were just being pushed. And I think people were just kind of, I don't want to say like necessarily like following the leader, but I just think it was just the thing to do. It was like that's how you made your music more intense. You know what I mean? Like the tempo just made it like just gnarlier and heavier. So I think that was like it was just the thing that people were doing. And I'm almost like, I hesitate to use the word like in style, but it's just it was just what was happening at the time, and it was, if you could play faster, that was like, oh, like they're fast. Like that was definitely kind of a something to admire, and so, De Kreuzen were just kind of following like those bands and bands like DOA. And it was just like a thing where it's like, okay, like let's just try and speed things up a little bit, because it's one thing to be fast and slide, and that's, it's fine. That's its own thing. I'm not going to name any names. There's bands that, I love that. But like when you're fast and tight, that's a different thing. And that shows that like these guys practice, right? So I think that was just the thing. They were just like practice on. They're like, all right, push the tempos a little bit. Let's push the tempos a little bit. Because I have like a old live performance, Stella, has been released. Not a lot of people have it. And there's some songs that ended up on the first De Kreuzen record that are played at like, by comparison, they sound mid-tempo. And you can kind of make out the riffs a little bit better because they're not played at like breakneck speed. But it's like, it's really cool to hear. And it's like, oh, like they like. There's early footage of the Bad Brains playing like Attitude, and they're like wearing suits, and it's pretty mid tempo, and then you listen to like, the Black Dots, and it's a little bit faster, and then you listen to the Roar cassette, and it's a little bit faster, and then by the time you get to like Rock for Light, they've shaved teens off the song that it's gotten so fast. I don't necessarily think they were necessarily like following other bands like we want to be like them, because like. There's this thing that I've heard other people talk about. There's an artist, there's a rapper, Fonte Coleman. He's in a group called Little Brother. He talks about like this sort of phases of being influenced. He says like imitation, inspiration, and innovation, right? And imitation is like, I want to be like Black Flag, right? And then inspiration is like, I am like inspired by Black Flag. I'm making music that's inspired by Black Flag. And then innovation is like, Black Flag has pushed me to, I guess like the creativity and my love of Black Flag has pushed me to innovate something else completely, right? And a lot of people don't get to that third stage. A lot of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can hear bands and you can hear like, oh, you're kind of doing this and you're kind of doing that. You listen to the Strokes and you can hear Television, right?
Yep.
But it doesn't really matter because they're good, right? But it takes a special group of people to really get that third stage of, well, I want to kind of do my own thing. And De Kreuzen got to that point, for sure.
Sahan Jayasuriya is the author of Don't Say Please, The Oral History of De Kreuzen. Let's talk about the name change to Die Kreuzen, October of 1981 that happened. How did they come up with that name, and what does it mean?
So it's kind of conflicting accounts. Some people say it's a German language Bible. Some people say it was just a German book. I just kind of bring them all up at the same time because I've never really given a straight answer. But Diane, who came up with that name, and then she's like, "Yeah, I'm going to start this band called Die Kreuzen," and then whatever, either she didn't or whatever, but they ended up with the name.
It's a cool name, man. You got to admit, it's mysterious.
It's a great name. It's definitely not always pronounced. If I had a penny for every time someone said "Die Kreuzen," D Kreuzen, yeah. But it's technically the spelling doesn't translate perfectly to something, but it technically is either like the sign of the cross or like crossing, like the crossing, I guess, or even to some people, I guess it's like the crosses. But it fucking looks great.
Yes,
It looks great on record cover. I mean, if you get that, you don't need to think about it anymore.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
During our brief intermission, let's take a flying trip from the land of fantasy to everyday life.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Lyrically, let's talk lyrics now. So Dan Kubinski, he avoided addressing politics, which wasn't the norm for punk and hardcore bands. Talk about his lyrics and how he preferred also listeners to assign whatever meaning they wished to his songs. And I believe in the future albums, he didn't want the lyrics printed.
Yeah, after the first record in 1984, they just consciously didn't print lyric sheets. And I think Dan had said, I'm paraphrasing him, but to the effect of he just kind of preferred the listener just, attack meaning songs, right? And as, the music changed, the music also kind of, I think, just had a little bit more of like an emotional heft to it. And so when you're making music that's kind of that emotionally heavy, it's pretty easy to, attach whatever meaning you want to it, right? And I mean, that's something REM did too in the early days. They didn't print their lyric sheets, and people always talk about how like the vocals were mixed really low, and Michael Stipe's voice was kind of like mumbling a little bit. So, a lot of people didn't know what the lyrics were. And in the case of Die Kreuzen, you didn't really know what he was saying, but you knew that it had some emotional weight to it, and it had to do with how he was delivering it. And in some ways, that's better than having a lyric sheet. You know what I mean? Because if you have a lyric sheet in front of you, it might not resonate with you the same way that it does, with you having to kind of come up with your own meaning to the song.
Sure.
But early on, yeah, I think there's a lot of bands, there's great hardcore bands who, like their thing was just, addressing the political climate at the time, which, needed to be addressed. And, all the flyers have like, Reagan on it, and I'm not going to curse on your podcast, but like there's they would take images of Reagan and make him do some pretty interesting things, hilariously interesting things. And, a lot of bands played with that imagery and just had, a political agenda to their lyrics. And it's great. I think it was definitely really common at the time for punk and hardcore bands to be political. And, the band just kind of chose to not be political. I think lyrically, like on the early material, the early demos and the first 7-inch and the first full length, I think the lyrics were definitely just like kind of personal politics and just, kind of talking about things people experience at that time in life and, conflict amongst friends. And I think there's a general just kind of feeling of like disillusionment and alienation that I think a lot of people felt at that time. And it was just writing from, that perspective.
There was the EP in 1982. It's titled Cows and Beer, and that was followed by the debut self-titled album in 1984. The debut came after the band returned from California, and at this time, they're fragmented. The future of the band is uncertain. They're burned out, bummed out, but they reform after a short time. What are your thoughts on this album, and particularly the vocals? Because you say Dan's style was the most notable shift.
That first record is, yeah, it's one of the best hardcore records ever made. And I think one of the reasons why is it does stand out. Um, the music at that point, they've been playing those songs for so long, so they're so well rehearsed. So the band is just super tight, super tight. And I think in this time, Dan had been singing a lot and, figuring out how he wanted to use his voice. And, by this point on this first record, I mean, no one was really shredding their vocal cords that way. People would scream for dramatic effects, but a lot of the hardcore guys were like shouting or barking. No one was like really screaming. It was like him and John Brannon from Negative Approach was doing it. I mean, John was really doing it later on with Laughing Hyenas. And there's kind of more obscure bands like Siege who were doing it, and even to lesser degree, John, the singer of Void, he was doing it a little bit too. But no one was just like every song all the time, just screaming your guts out. So it was a very different sound for the time, and the production was enhanced a little bit too by there's a little bit of reverb and atmosphere on that record. That I kind of liken to the first Joy Division album, Unknown Pleasures. It kind of has that, maybe not that drastic amount of reverb, but it's definitely like a spacious sounding record. And at the time, a lot of punk records were pretty dry. And when you add that amount of atmosphere to the vocals, especially, it gives us this really like haunting, tortured quality. It just kind of amplifies that. To me, that later on, you'd hear a lot of like Scandinavian black metal bands really do that. But this is, quite a bit before that. So it's just so ahead of its time and so good. That first album it's really an incredible record.
Yeah, and it got the respect of other musicians. Some great quotes in the book from Soundgarden's Kim Thayil, Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, so many people. Some great quotes from the late, great Steve Albini. I still can't believe he's gone. The renowned musician and audio engineer who produced Nirvana's In Utero, which we have to talk about where you are right now in relation to that album. But he admired the band's originality on that first album. He said, quote, "There's just nothing about that Die Kreuzen record that sounds like it's received wisdom. It sounds like they dreamed all that shit up on their own. Like no one would have ever been taught to play that way. You can only come up with those things on your own." That says it all. I mean, that's the respect that they were getting from the fellow artists.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this too, as we kind of addressed earlier, like later on, people kind of, they didn't necessarily like understand those later records, and they're like, oh, it's so different. But, the thing that makes them so great and makes this first record so great is that they were different, right? Like they sounded pretty different from other hardcore bands, and they made this really cool hardcore record. And I think people, fans specifically, some fans, I guess the ones who maybe didn't like understand the later records, they didn't stop and think like, well, the reason why I like them is because they're different.
Steve Albini's a guy who I could see would love that type of record because that's the way he was. That's the whole reason Nirvana wanted him to produce In Utero, because they didn't want to make something like Nevermind. They wanted something a little bit off the grid, something dangerous, something that the average producer wouldn't do. So talk about where you are. By the way, speaking of Steve Albini and In Utero, the reason you're checking in from your vehicle right now is because you came from a very cool place.
I was just for like a day and some change. I was at Pachyderm Recording Studio, which is in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, which is this like 4,000 population tiny town. It's about 45 minutes out of the Twin Cities. And it's just it's a really small town, and there's this wonderful studio there. There's like and that's where Nirvana made In Utero. That's where like The Wedding Present recorded, and I think Live did Throwing Copper there. Tons and tons and tons of great records. PJ Harvey did Rid of Me there. Superchunk recorded there. A lot of indie rock bands like Unrest, they recorded there. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's it's Hum's You'd Prefer an Astronaut is credited there. They did one song there. I think the rest of that record was done elsewhere. But yeah, like tons of great records in the 90s and beyond. Like I think more recently, like 10 years ago, I think that band Norma Jean, I think they recorded there. So it's a destination, but like the entire thing is meant for you to like live on the premises. So there's like a separate living quarters that's just like so not unlike it. It's just so distinct. It's just like spiral staircases and crazy, just 70s carpet. And it's just like this really wonderful space that's like surrounded by like a ravine almost. And it's just like a really great place to just be if you're trying to like focus and make music. And my friend Graham Hunt, he's working on his next record right now. And he had me come up there and hang out for a day and shoot photos and just, I mean, everyone there was like 10 or 11 people who were playing on that record, and they're all really good friends of mine, big parts of like the Milwaukee and Madison music community. So I was just hanging out with them, and now I'm on my way home. But
very cool.
For me as a music fan, it was a no-brainer. I mean, I think I told Graham when he said he's recording at Pachyderm, it's like, can I just like go up there and touch the door? Like,
yeah, right.
Because I mean, I probably will never get the opportunity to record there because it's a nice studio, so I don't necessarily have that kind of funding to record. But just to be in a space like that, it's just like so special. To feel it brings you closer to the music you love in a way that you may not always necessarily get to be. So it's like some people maybe feel like going to like I don't know like Sun Studios or something like that. They're into that stuff, which like that stuff's great for sure. But like I just feel like when you can see the place where these records were made, it just I don't know, it just feels a certain way. Like if you've ever toured Hitsville, the original Motown studio in Detroit, I mean, like I walked in there and I got misty-eyed just thinking about like music history was made here. It's fantastic. So you get it.
Oh yeah, man.
You're one of us.
I envy you. I envy you.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
The curtain will go up on Act 2 after our short intermission.
Getting back to D. Kreuzen, now let's talk about the album October File. That came out a couple of years after the debut, and the band moves away from hardcore into slower, more conceptual work. I don't know if I've ever heard a band transition so quickly and just progress and evolve so quickly. It's interesting to read how the guys in the band had already started to move towards that sound by the time that first album was already out. Keith Brammer talks about listening to Joy Division and Susie and the Banshees and REM, Sisters of Mercy. All these, you referred to these bands earlier. Talk about that transition and how the guys saw that debut as an end to that part of what the band was doing. I mean, they were already moving on.
Yeah, I mean, they were just listening to so much music, and even by the time they were making that first record, they were already discovering other things. And it's always kind of like, I don't really want to speak for the band members, but Keith said this the other day, so I can just repeat it. He's like, we just got bored. They just got bored, and I think anything, if you do it for enough time, like you're gonna get bored with it. And I think they just wanted to, I think any musician just wants to make the kind of music that they themselves would want to listen to. Right. At least like that's how I always approach music making. Like it's, I'm going to be playing it. It should be fun. I should like it. And, they just wanted to play the kind of music that they were into. And so they just kind of, but again, they weren't just like, I want to be Sisters of Mercy. It's just like, well, what does Sisters of Mercy make me want to do? Right. What is Joy Division or Echo and the Bunnymen or the Birthday Party or whoever, like, what is The Cure? Like, what does that make me want to do? And then that's how you get these later records that, like once the influences, like, oh, I can kind of hear that, but like on the surface, you're just like, I don't really. This sounds like this is different, So.
What was the response to the stark contrast to the first record and this one by critics and fans?
Well, with the first record, it was just like everyone loved that record. I mean, to me, it's like there's some changes in production, but generally speaking, it's still just hardcore, right? But the second record. There were some people who really wanted another hardcore record and they just didn't give them that. And I think some of those people kind of felt, they were just upset about that. But, for the people who maybe abandoned them because they were, changing, slowing down, maybe becoming a little bit more melodic, there's people who are now, maybe they wouldn't have liked the first record, but they like the second record because it's a little bit more melody driven, right? So they're starting to gain a different audience and, people who are maybe not people who are into hardcore, but maybe they're into something like Husker Du. And now in Husker Du too, they were, evolving and moving to, towards a more melodic songwriting too. So, I think people were just turned on to the newer stuff they were doing, even though there was maybe other people who, liked the older stuff who didn't dig it as much.
You're right. Quote, still, October File was only the beginning of the band's journey away from hardcore. It marked the start of a pattern that we would see for the remainder of the band's career. Next two albums produced by Butch Vig, 1988's Century Days, and the band's final album, which was 1991's Cement. He also produced the 1989 EP Gone Away, Where does the band go sonically on those last albums?
It's interesting because things definitely got more melodic, but I would argue that the music also became more difficult. Like hardcore is abrasive music and it's fast, but in some ways it's kind of easy to listen to. Like you can sing along the Minor Threat songs. You know what I mean? Like they have hooks, they have choruses, and you can be fast and you can, even if you're maybe not into like how abrasive the vocals are or whatever, you can like, pogo around and have a good time. It's fun. Like hardcore is fun music. It's like early 80s American hardcore is fun music. And I'm not saying it's necessarily happy music, but it's fun. And once you get darker and maybe gothier and a little bit more dissonant, you can still be singing, but in some ways the music can become a little bit more difficult. And I think what we talked about earlier, where it's just like, they influence a bunch of people, but they maybe never were able to get to that next level. And I think one of the reasons why they never made that full break into the mainstream, I think, A, they couldn't find a major label that wanted to give them the kind of creative control that they wanted. But B, they didn't, labels didn't really know what to do with them because they were like straddling a lot of lines. They sort of were kind of metally, but they're kind of post-punky and kind of goth. And, especially at that time, like labels, they're like, well, who do we sell this to?
Yeah.
Right.
Would it be fair to compare them to Jane's Addiction prior to Jane's Addiction becoming big because they're metal?
I mean, I guess it's like similar ingredients making two different meals. I could see that.
And they were a little ahead of their time to where
a little ahead of their time. Yeah, at least Jane's Addiction got, I mean, they had hits. I mean, like,
eventually,
eventually the Jane Says and Been Caught Stealing and stuff like that. But,
but at first it was like, what are we going to do with this?
because it's not one thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like people don't know they don't know who to sell it to or how to sell it, right? And I think that was definitely part of it. But you brought up earlier, like the Gone Away EP.
Yeah.
Like that to me is a songwriting achievement.
Yes.
That to me is the best song that they wrote.
That is that's my favorite song. Absolutely.
Me too. It's a fantastic song. And I think it really covers all the ground that band covered minus the super fast speed of hardcore. But it's really kind of beautiful and melancholy, and it's in 3/4 time. It has this kind of rolling quality, and it has there's all these different like guitar hooks, and then and Dan's singing wonderfully, but even then he has to take it to the screen. He has to scream just for a little bit, right? So it's like it's a super melodic song, and then it's just like it just left turns to these kind of really like his kind of signature tortured pain kind of scream. But it's such a wonderful song. It's 3 minutes long. In an alternate universe, to me, that's a modern rock radio hit.
Absolutely. When I first heard it, and I was telling you before we recorded that I knew of the band, knew the name, but really didn't listen to a whole lot of their music. And this has happened so many times through this podcast, after reading a book, I listened to the music, and I more often than not fall in love with the band. And I've done it with this band. And when I heard Gone Away for the first time, I'm like, how the fuck how does this song just skip past so many people? Because it's just the timing of it. If it was a couple of years later,
I mean, I've said like, well, their last album Cement, was recorded and released in '91, and I think, they released Gone Away as an EP because it had been a little bit since they'd put out something new, and Touch and Go, I was like, maybe we should do like an EP or something like that.
But what's cool is, by the way, we mentioned Aerosmith. The Gone Away, the next track is Seasons of Wither.
Seasons of Wither, right?
Aerosmith,
which is a great
cover. Yeah,
right. It's a great cover. But I think if they would have saved Gone Away for the Cement album and had that been like the single off that record, I think maybe it would have gotten a little bit more people would have heard it, because I mean, the timing of Cement is so interesting because right before they made Cement, Butch he'd wrapped up work on the first Smashing Pumpkins record, Gish. And then either right before or maybe after, or maybe like he started working on Cement and then finished it later. But Butch had gone to LA to Sound City to go make Nevermind.
Isn't that crazy?
And so the timing of it is it's so wild, right? To think about, there's this article that was in Hit Parader in, I think, 92, early 92. And it was one of those 40 of the blah, blah, blahs to blah, 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 right? And I think it was like 40 alternative metal bands to watch in the year 92 or something like that. And on the front page, Smashing Pumpkins, Afghan Wigs to Kreuzen. And it's like, so, I mean, they were right there, I think maybe one of the reasons why they didn't break through is, maybe labels didn't know what to do with them, but also they were maybe a little bit too difficult to break into the mainstream.
Atlantic Records, you said in the book, wanted to sign them right after they broke up.
After they had split, Mike Gitter, who went on to sign so many great bands. Mike Gitter is such a rad dude and has done so much awesome stuff. I mean, he ended up signing Jawbox to Atlantic and signing a lot of great bands from the underground and, giving them the resources to make, these kind of bigger records. And I mean, I love that record Jawbox made for Atlantic. It's Savory, to me, again, should have been a top 40 hit. I don't know why it wasn't. In my universe, that is a top 40 hit, but yeah, it's just a little bit too late. And, of course, there is a little bit of the what if factor in that book, well, what if? And, we'll never know. But, I think if anything, they maybe would sign to a major label, make a record that they wanted to make, and maybe more people would have heard it, but not enough to please the major label.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I'm going to need some pliers and a set of 30-weight ball bearings.
What?
If Fred gets here before I'm back, you can tell him to start without me.
What the hell you need ball bearings for?
Oh, come on, guys. It's so simple. Maybe you need a refresher course. Hey, it's all ball bearings nowadays.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock Podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock Podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Here's the quote from Vig in the book about when he first saw the band. This says it all. It was psychedelic rock, it was punk, it was almost metal at points, and yet they had this great pop sensibility to their songs as well. So he saw something there. He saw what he saw in Nirvana.
100%. I mean, Butch Vig is a pop guy through and through, and he calls himself a self-proclaimed pop geek, is what he says. And so, I mean, he's the guy to bring hooks out of people. I mean, the jump from Bleach to Nevermind is a very big jump. Obviously, the production played a big role in it, and obviously, there's not that many songs on Bleach that are as hooky as the stuff on Nevermind. But Butch really brought out those melodic elements, and then Andy Wallace, who's known for mixing like Slayer, made it just sound super heavy. So then you have these really heavy pop songs, and it appeals to the aggressive music crowd, but it also appeals to people who maybe have never heard Sonic Youth or Dinosaur Jr. or whoever else, right? And had they been able to make another record with Butch, who knows? But we'll never know.
Yeah, they broke up in 92.
They broke up in 92. Yeah.
Butch Vig says, he told you that, yeah, there were internal battles. There was some conflict going on there while they were recording Cement, but he didn't think they were going to break up. What led to the breakup?
It's nothing really interesting. They got to the point where we're playing, we're touring all the time. We're touring more than we're at home. The audiences aren't necessarily getting any bigger. In some cases, maybe they're getting a little bit smaller. And I think they just felt like, we don't really know where we fit, in a sense. They would play to nicer sized audience when, bands like Sonic Youth would take them out on the road. But then when they would go out on their own again, it'd be like, well, we're playing to, 100 people, 150 people.
My feeling is, listening to the music and seeing where music went and seeing how big Nirvana got, if you put them out on the road, open for Nirvana for a little while there, build up that following, next thing you know, I think they're headlining their own gigs. MTV's picking up on them. Modern rock radio is getting big. Wait a year or two.
I think at that point, like being affiliated with Nirvana was definitely helpful. It helped the Melvins get signed, and people were now turned on to bands like the Beans or the Wipers or whatever else. But and then even like they took Jawbreaker out on tour for 10 days, and that resulted in Jawbreaker becoming like a recorded by major labels. The sort of unsignable band eventually. They signed to a major label, right? But who's to say? I know Kurt Cobain was a fan.
He was. Okay.
He wrote about. He mentions them in his journals, and it wasn't like in one of those lists, but it was like a letter he wrote to Buzz from the Melvins, and it was or maybe a letter he didn't send to Buzz. I don't know, but there was definitely something in there where it said, "Have you heard the new Kreuzen album?" So it was at least a band he was aware of, and I think Kurt was a huge Touch and Go Records guy, right? He loved Big Black and Scratch Acid and all that stuff. So I'm sure he at least knew those records. It's pretty safe to say he liked them, but I can't make that assumption. I know Dave Grohl's a big fan for sure, but I'd say if you were into Touch and Go bands at that time, I think most people who were around for that era of Touch and Go, they liked the Kreuzen. So.
Well, this book will get some exposure for the band as well. Don't Say Please, the oral history of Die Kreuzen, and it's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold, and look for it at your nearest bookstore. Go to thebookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. And where can people find you online, Sahan?
So you can follow me on Instagram. I have an Instagram page for the book. It's just at Die Kreuzen Book. That's kind of just where I post just stuff about the band, and then just like updates in terms of like events and stuff that I'm doing for the book. And that's kind of the best way to figure out, everything that's, going on with this book right now.
Sahan, thanks, man. Thanks for just sneaking in this interview, coming back from that very cool trip to a part of rock and roll history. So
I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. It was wonderful. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. You're doing me a favor here.
Cool.
That's it. It's in the books.